is a professor and the director of the School of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Taylor earned her MA and PhD degrees from Purdue University. Prior to going to the University of Tennessee, she taught public relations and communication at the University of Oklahoma, where I met her. She was my advisor. So Dr. Taylor's research focuses on nation building, civil society, dialogue, and the use of websites and new technology. Her research has taken her to many post-conflict countries, such as Afghanistan, the Balkans, Iraq, and Sudan. She has published over 60 refereed articles and 30 book chapters. In 2010, Dr. Taylor was distinguished with the Pathfinder Award from the Institute of Public Relations for her original program of scholarly research that has made a significant contribution to the body of public relations, research, and practice. Most recently, she was invited to join the prestigious Arthur Page Society and has been serving on there for 2 years now. Please give your undivided attention to her.
Thank you, Adam. All right, how are you today?
Good.
Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with me. Because Friday afternoons are usually when graduate students and assistant professors do all of their writing and thinking before they head out to other activities. Excellent. Well, thank you again, and thank you for inviting me. What a wonderful college you have here. It's beautiful. And what a wonderful university. This is my first time visiting Chapel Hill. So it's very special. So thank you for your time. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about some of my research, some of my perspectives, and then in the last 20 minutes I'll answer any of your questions. Okay? Then I believe there's a social afterwards. Okay.
We do it for everybody.
What's that?
We do it for everybody.
Excellent. I would hope so. As Adam mentioned, I have spent the last 20 years traveling around the world to post-conflict countries. I study how public relations helps to rebuild societies, communities. And that experience from going to places like the Balkans or Iraq or Afghanistan helps me to understand that there are many different roles that public relations plays across the world that have rarely been captured by our literature. Our literature has essentially followed a very business or organizational-centric model, and I think if we open our minds and look out, we actually can find other ways that public relations can contribute to society. So as a sort of an overview, when you've been around a long time, and I've been around a long time, and I never thought this would happen, because my advisor, Carl Botan, he always knew stuff, right? And he'd say, 20 years ago this was happening. I'm like, really? Well, 20 years ago, now that I've been in the field for 20 years, the field of public relations has evolved and transitioned, and it's been a very positive one for the academic study and the ethical practice of public relations. And here's how I sort of see it, is that public relations roles in organizations and societies have evolved. In the beginning, we followed functional approaches, where media relations, agenda setting, and other really one-way communication tactics were the norm. So professionals and academics study them. So if you ever go back to the 1980s and look at the literature, the very little that existed in public relations, it was looking at press releases, right? What gets put into a news story from a press release, right? And that was important at the time. In the 1980s and early 90s, public relations, in order to gain credibility, became known as a management function, and the excellence research through James Gruding and his colleagues and students who replicated over and over again was the idea that excellence is what public relations should be. Excellence meaning that it's professional, it's managed by a public relations person. We have all of these different factors. But what happens when you travel overseas is many of the tenets of excellence, such as the symmetry, cannot happen in societies that have high power distance, and other factors, historical and cultural, that influence organizations. So excellence then gave way to relationship building, or what we call the organization public relations literature, 1997, 1998. We started seeing these OPR, which essentially looked at how organizations, we can measure the relationships between an organization and a public. That's, again, another innovation. Very useful for us because it helped us to give us a model or framework. And what do people love to do? They love to be able to replicate a model or framework and study it in different contexts. In the early 2000s, we actually had enough research in public relations to step back and say, where have we been and where are we going? And in 2005, I think, I never remember if the state of the field is 4 or 5. around there. Carl Botan, my advisor, and I wrote a piece called The State of the Field of Public Relations in the Journal of Communication, where we actually sort of traced the development of the field through the different theories that were prominent. And essentially, we argued that public relations was evolving from a functional perspective to a co-creational that was beginning to look more at how meaning was co-created between organizations and publics. And this reflected our rhetorical roots, understanding that, how we socially construct reality. Then in the mid-2000s, Robert Heath, then at the University of Houston and now emeritus, he started writing about this thing called fully functioning society theory. And he identified these 9 premises that if an organization did them, then they would actually be participating in a more fully functioning society. And the argument was that organizations had a much greater role than just making profit and returning shareholder value, that as community members, they actually had important and usually unknown roles. All that led me to start thinking about societal social capital and civil society. And the term today, whenever you look at large development projects that are fostered by the Europeans or the United States or other countries, they use the word civil society, right? They used to use democracy. Bad idea, right? Then they used, let's see, there was civil society, there was nation building, right? Nation building, bye-bye, right? Civil society became the preferred term, and then of course, Maureen in 2002 wrote the nice piece that said, not so civil society, a critique of nation building, which essentially was a very big critique of my work, saying that, no, the opposite of civil society is an uncivil society, and that we don't want to say that that's what those places are. So we see this transition from a functional approach all the way to this idea that public relations has roles to play in society. So what I'm going to share with you today are some of the ideas that I've had about this, some of the articles that I've written, and some of the studies that I've conducted along with Adam and my PhD students from Oklahoma who are now at universities all across the United States. So this functional perspective, the early years of the field, right? Early research embodied what we would call a functional perspective because public relations was instrumentalized. Publics were instrumentalized. You conducted public relations to achieve a certain organizational goal. And every single student would say, of course they do. And of course they should, right? Organizations should be able to participate in the marketplace of ideas. But what happened was that when public relations is only that, then it's a very small function, and it's not very professional, is it? If that's all you do. So under the functional perspective, it would be media relations, agenda setting, issues management, and that was the role of a practitioner. Today, public relations is more about creating shared meaning. It's about understanding and engaging publics, and the nice thing that happened under the co-creational turn was that we no longer just looked at corporations as those organizations that practice public relations. It opened it up to this idea that activists, social movements, non-governmental organizations, and individuals also can use the same theories and practices of public relations and participate in that marketplace or that discourse of the public sphere. So that's sort of the second trend, was this co-creational perspective. And there are a couple things from media here that matter. Number one, it no longer is just public relations for media relations. It's still there, but there's other things as well. And the second thing that's important about the co-creational turn was that the organization doesn't have to be the center of the study of public relations. It's no longer the organization to a public. Instead, we actually can look at the meaning and how the meaning is taking on different shapes and changing and evolving as different actors in the public sphere talk about an issue, talk about a problem, and define and try to put forward multiple solutions. So public relations tasks, instead of just being media relations, become engagement with publics, right? Town hall meetings, public forums, all those really uncomfortable things where people stand up and tell you what's wrong with your organization. Oh, I hate those. But you know what? You have to do them because you have to listen. You do research, right? It gives research a much larger role to understand the different stakeholder groups and their communication needs out there, and then relationship building as well. So we have that transition. Older theories functional, newer theories like dialogue or civil dialogue essentially, and a little OPR have moved to the co-creational. I see a third, And it's this that I believe that has the greatest role for public relations to contribute to society. Heath's fully functioning society, and I haven't been able to differentiate civil society from Heath's fully functioning society, so I'm going to put them together. He has 9 principles, and I'll let him have them. Right? He's got nine premises, and they're pretty good. So a fully functioning society posits that relationships amongst organizations and groups create a social capital. Are you familiar with the term social capital? We have been arguing for years, what's the outcome of public relations? Right? What does public relations provide to organizations? Well, under the functional approach, it was media coverage. Under the co-creational approach, it was understanding. Under the civil society approach, what public relations can do is create and recreate the conditions that foster a civil society, where groups and individuals and organizations and everyone and everything can participate. So what the civil society function of public relations does is it incorporates the components of both functional and co-creation, and argues that you still will need to have media relations and agenda setting and all these other things, but that everybody can do it and everybody should do it. And that these two approaches together, creating a civil society approach, allow groups and communities to be stronger and to better meet the needs of all of their members. So what it's doing is we're taking the organization, which was the center of the functional approach, we're moving to what used to be the relationship under the co-creational, and now we're moving to the society or community as that third path of what public relations can do. So what can public relations do to foster this civil society? And if you don't like the term civil society because of the baggage that it embodies, and there's baggage in any framework, correct? You could just say community building, perhaps. Community empowerment. You pick it. I don't think it matters. I think what matters is the philosophy behind it and the perception of public relations' role. It creates the conditions for open discussion. So what does public relations do? Well, we articulate messages, we articulate solutions, we put them out into the public, we listen, and organizations adapt and change to meet the expectations of their publics. That's a huge difference than organizations adapt and change audiences to meet their needs. We believe that an informed public can make better decisions. So every piece of information is valuable. We help create a place that's safe for all people to participate in discussions about topics. And as we go through contentious issues in society, that there are spaces and places where these discussions can occur, and universities are a wonderful place for those, because they are safe spaces. That organizations are open to input, criticism, and change. That we understand organizations as dynamic, open processes, right? I went to Purdue, and I had Dennis Mumby. Anyone here take an Orcom class with Professor Mumby over in Com? Oh, you should, right? We were fined, essentially, if we ever used the word organization, because it's not an organization, it's not a noun, right? It is a thing, it is organizing. There was no jar, there was no like swear jar or anything, but it was the idea that we should talk about organizing, because organizations just aren't physical structures, but it's the process of human beings interacting together and working to accomplish something. So organizations must be open to input, criticism, and change, because they need to be dynamic and react to what the society wants from them. That issues are discussed and solutions are offered by many actors. So there's not just one solution to every problem, because there's not just one problem, and there's not just one definition of the problem. And more importantly for this class, right, for this school that Adam asked me to talk about media, is that the media, both traditional and new, play an important role here. Because now we have lots of media. Small individual bloggers, citizen journalists, and then we have our legacy media, and they also perform an important role, or to help or to hinder the creation of civil society. This title, Looking Over, Looking Out, and Moving Forward, comes from a 2015 article published in Communication Theory to identify a network approach to public relations. Now, why does a public relations piece go to Com Theory? Because nobody wanted to publish in a PR journal. Because the PR journal wasn't ready for the arguments that we made about public relations' role in society. Neither of them. So we found Com Theory. Com theory allowed us to essentially argue that because there are multiple systems of relationships in a community, public relations performs different functions that allow those systems and subsystems and processes to coordinate and cooperate. And that actually what our society is many different organizations, many different publics, many different media types, and many different levels of relationships and networks of relationships. That public relations isn't just about that, even functional or co-creational anymore. The idea that dyadic relationships are gone. There is no such thing as the relationship between the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a public, because that relationship is mediated by another relationship with another public and another organization and another issue. We don't just have relationships with each other, do we? We have relationships with somebody who has a relationship with someone else. And that's where public relations needs to be putting its theoretical and methodological power, is to study that. Moving it from a dyadic, static, one organization, one public, to a complex system of interrelationships that you might not even know that what's happening in another university is affecting your university. Does that make sense? So that's what we wanted to study, and we tied it to the idea of civil society. Civil society is this idea there's networks of associations and groups. And the best place to study civil society for me has been in transitional nations that are emerging from conflict. In many countries that are emerging from conflict, there was no civil society. That's when conflict happened. It was one of the reasons why conflict happened, because there was no active movement of people and groups. So think about today, right? We've got associations for women, for people of different cultural groups, aged groups, right? Ethnic groups, cultural groups. We have all of these things. We have unions, we have educational institutions, we have associations and industry groups. We have all of these groups. But when a government controls its country and controls access for people to meet, then there is no civil society. So watching the evolution of a civil society in a place where it's brand new is very exciting, because you get to see how unique subsystems emerge. I like Hauser's description of civil society. He did it in the 98 piece. He did a wonderful history of the conceptual of civil society, and he argued it's just an alternative way of understanding the discursive nature of the public sphere. That if we think about that, it's like the place. Think in your mind of how talk gets done through media, through interpersonal, through organizational. And that all organizations have a role to play in civil society: the media, the business community, government, nonprofit organizations, activist organizations, global organizations. Right now, the United Nations and the European Union are discussing the migrant crisis, right? The fact that somebody called it a crisis, and someone decided to call it migrant versus refugee, and everything else that's used, right, rhetorically here, we see all of this happening. And what we understand in civil society is not every organization has the same commitment to it, and that not every organization will help, because some will hinder. And some will hinder through lobbying, which, no problem with lobbying, right? In a civil society, it's fine. But it's when it's hidden lobbying, or when the amount of money is just so great that they buy access to political leaders and decision makers. So there are organizations that can help and those that can hinder civil society. So the question then becomes, what are the outcomes of public relations in the civil society model, and what are the benefits to the organization and to the society? What are the tangible outcomes of public relations? Well, in the past, it was reputation, it was publicity, and the idea of license to operate, which is a term that business schools use, right? Organizations engage in corporate social responsibility and public relations. They are continued to operate unfettered by government regulation and policy. That's what they do, right? They want to be able to do what they want to do. Well, what if today the outcome that was the beneficial and desired outcome wasn't publicity or reputation or license to operate or other economic things, but instead it was the creation of social capital that not only benefits the organization, but benefits the society as well. And that changes public relations then. It changes how we study it, changes how we practice it, changes how we measure it. Because if the outcome is a social capital, this amorphous thing, right? Can you see social capital? Actually, you can. You can see a park. You can see people picking up trash on the highway, right? You can see that things are better now, that schools are better, that roads are better, that we're safer, that we take care of each other. You actually can see it. And if you can observe it, then you can study it. So a couple things about what this social capital is. And have you heard the term social capital before? Excellent. Social capital is just one more form of capital. So we get our economic capital, which is money. Right? And we used to think that organizations just needed money, right? They needed operating capital, they needed to return capital, shareholder, investor, and all that. Actually, that's not as important. I mean, it's good, you have to have it, but cultural capital is also very important. Now, I noticed a very interesting part of cultural capital in this building. Every room, except maybe the bathroom, seems to be named. Is the bathroom named? I don't think so.
We are working on it.
There are opportunities. Exactly. There are opportunities for naming. So you are a part of a cultural capital. You gain access to people by the nature of your being a student or professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You gain access to resources and relationships because of where you are and the history of this organization. And you will pass them down to your advisees, right? So Adam benefits from my cultural capital, and then he's going to benefit you with his cultural capital, and eventually I'll benefit, right, because networks and relationships. But the third type is this idea of social capital that says that actually there are resources in relationships and networks of relationships. And that's why I always use the term diversity of ties. That part of your task as a graduate student is to develop a diversity of ties with people, your friends, people in other departments, people at other universities, other scholars, and that there is a capital, there is a tangible benefit for you, and that is called social capital. So how do you study social capital in public relations? Well, I hope you have an answer, because we're only like when in baseball we say they're painting the edges, right, of home plate, right, whatever it's called. We're only like at the edges. When you make an argument calling for a new way to envision public relations, you got to come up with a way of actually studying it. That's why we need smart young people like you. So essentially, we're calling for this new vision of public relations in a civil society, and it requires revised methods or additional methods. We have to understand meaning and networks and the social capital. And we have to consider things like, what's our unit of analysis? Because it used to be the organization and the public, or the media hit, right? That was the unit of analysis. All those website studies that look at, or social media studies that look at the tweet, or the Facebook post, or something like that. The unit of analysis is a very small thing. If you're trying to move the argument up to talk about how public relations contributes to society, how do you study an entire society? Talk amongst yourself and figure it out, and that will be your dissertation, or your master's thesis, or your first article when you're an assistant professor. So we need to consider unit of analysis. How is shared meaning measured? Well, Adam's dissertation actually tried that, right? He came at it from a couple different methodological perspectives. I think he did a good job. And how do you methodologically move past studying one public and one organization and still have enough time to publish it and treat it in discrete units so they can get published, but you're looking at a bigger picture? So here's what you have to do, and here's where we are right now. We started with the conceptual. The 2015 common theory piece laid out the different relationships in this public relations network approach. So we decided that networks would be, because that's where social capital resides, in networks of relationships, that shared values become the building blocks of networks, right? We engage in networks with people who we share some type of value with. Relationships with others, and the community level analysis. And so this is one of the tables, or one of the figures from our 2015 piece. And those three pictures at the top that look sort of odd, these are three different types of networks, right? So we have our spoke and our wheel here, like with a center and a whole bunch of people who are connecting to each other. If you want to work toward that because there's a certain reason for it, like in risk and crisis communication, that might be a really good one, right? The whole linear relationship. You tell one person or one group, and one group tells another and another, and it's linear. You would do certain things with these weak ties, and you would use certain type of media and certain type of communication. If you wanted to connect two groups together, right, you would use a different set of tactics. And if you wanted to create this dense, like this is like the United States or something, right, there's other kinds of tie building strategies that you would use. Communication and media and other messages. So that public relations strategies and tactics that have traditionally been around media, right? Your strategy is to inform, to persuade, to motivate behavior. And your tactics are the news release, the event, the promotion, etc. Now we can actually use those strategies and tactics that we've used in traditional public relations at a larger level for networks. So how do you study this? This goes back to the big question of how do we study this? We decided to use professional associations. We decided because professional associations, we have public relations professional associations and journalist professional associations and doctors and lawyers and everything else. And joining a professional organization essentially means what? That you share those values. And what do professional associations do? They advocate on behalf of professions. And they're not just, they could be businesses and nonprofit members and government members. We looked and decided that professional associations would be the beginning of our study because these are groups across the world that like-minded people come together. Now, we could have done trade associations, right? We could have done union labor markets. We decided public relations and journalism associations because we actually believe that they play very important roles in societies. So our studies, the two studies I'm going to share with you are about professional associations as a starting place to understand how public relations contributes to society. Associations are comprised of different groups with shared values, and we treat those shared values of people who join an association as the building blocks of social capital. Where do the media come in here? Well, we actually argue that all of these associations function in and around media organizations. That public relations and media, although under the functional approach it was sort of a one-way, right? Public relations sent information to media, then the media disseminated it. Right? Very simple model. Never worked like that when I did it. A lot more work than that. And now today, public relations provides much more information, doesn't it, to the media? With mergers and acquisitions and the reduction of journalists and the complexity of issues that public relations provides even more. So one of our first studies was to actually look at the relationships between journalist associations and public relations associations across the world. We went to that, in the first study you should probably go global. Right? You should probably take the entire world into account. So the two studies, and I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to run through them. Two studies, ethical convergence, divergence, or communitas, right? Oh, communitas, new term, italics. This is a piece with Aimee Yang, who's my PhD student who now is at the University of Southern California at the Annenberg School. Me and good Professor Saffer. And our piece looks at the convergence and divergence in communitas between global organizations, professional associations of public relations, and journalism. And the second piece actually is a piece about public relations role in a global media ecology. So I'll go through them quickly, maybe not as fast, maybe not as slow as I wanted to, but you're in a journalism school, and the students on this side here in public relations, strategic communication, or something because I had lunch with you, right? So you're my ringers. Public relations, over the history of the field, has had what would be a good term to describe its relationship with media? Contentious, excellent, right? And think about our early history, right? Ivy Lee, Edward Bernays, the Creel Committee, right? Our history, we need a new history, definitely. The public relations journalism relationship has been described as a duel, right? A dance, a seduction, and in all of this, the media falls victim to those savvy public relations people who use them to get what they want. And that's the metaphor that you see in a lot of the histories of the development of journalism, public relations, is this tension. But it doesn't have to be that story. Media are changing, and so are public relations practices. In media, we have the blurring of the lines today, right? So with new types of media organizations and institutions, for instance, we have newsrooms now, right? The social media newsroom is taking information from organizations and individuals and packaging it, where you've got people who might be PR performing journalism roles. We see citizen journalists, right, emerging and reporting on local issues that media organizations no longer can because they don't have the staff for it. At the same time, we see a changing public relations because as public relations takes on larger societal roles, we're becoming more reflective. And this we have to give credit to the Europeans. The Europeans have done a very good job of conceptualizing public relations role as helping organizations adjust to societal expectations. And that public relations then provides the tools and the tactics for everyone to participate in public discourse. So we see this evolution. New technology, globalization, all of those things mean that both of the fields of journalism and public relations are changing. And our argument was maybe they're becoming more similar. Now that's heresy for half the journalists in the world, right? To say that public relations and journalism are becoming similar. So here's what we decided to do. We took the codes of ethics of, I think it's 34 public relations associations and matched them to the codes of ethics of, in the same country, of 34 journalist associations. Had them translated, they weren't in English already, and then used centering resonance research, right, where you actually look at the terms and where they're placed, where certain terms come earlier or later and what they're associated with. It's a content analysis tool. And we looked to see where there were dominant values of both public relations and public relations and journalism. We looked to see where they were similar, convergent, and where they were divergent, and were there any places where the codes of ethics of public relations and journalism were the same. 34 matched organizations, centering resonance analysis, factor analysis, and case studies. Right? We took case studies, we decided to take one more method and say, well, let's look at 3 different situations, where they converge, where they diverge, and what happens when they're exactly the same or share the exact same things. So our research questions, we essentially found that professionalism, advocacy, moral standards, client interest, expertise, relationship building are the core values in those 34 countries of public relations. That seems about right, right? Professionalism, because it's a code of ethics, so professionalism, moral standards, client's interests, expertise, and relationship building. For journalists, the key terms were professionalism, moral standards, social justice, human rights, and expertise. So we see actually professionalism, moral standards, and expertise consistent across codes in those 34 different nations across both their public relations and their journalism associations. We see, not unexpected, that public relations codes of ethics emphasized advocacy, clients' rights, and relationship building, whereas journalism advocates for society, social justice, and human rights. But they overlapped in these countries. They actually had more overlap than divergence. Austria, Argentina, Belgium. And if you can look at that group and tell me what they have in common, I would love to know. I have tried everything from cultural dimensions, legal systems. There is nothing that unless there was like one consultant who went around to all those countries and helped develop the codes of ethics. All right, so what we see happening with those 7 countries is this idea of communitas. Communitas isn't about convergence or divergence. It is about this feeling of a shared understanding of our role in contributing to society. And in those 7 countries, we see that both public relations and journalism contribute to the fully functioning society through their values. And that this might be the new metaphor that we use instead of the duel, the dance, the seduction, that communitas, which if you've ever been to a college sporting activity, you've been in a communitas situation. It's both religion and sport. When people who are very different join together for a moment and become one. Like, well, what's today? September 11th. There were those days after September 11th when everything, all the barriers to us melted away and we were Americans suffering in enormous pain. It doesn't have to be pain, though. It can be a joy, it could be a sporting event, it could be a wonderful celebration. And that's what we see happening, is that public relations and journalism in those countries, this communitas of how they both contribute to society, is happening. The last study from my last 4 minutes is, it's under review, so hopefully it's going to get accepted. I happen to like the piece. So if I have anything to say about it, it will get accepted. And so our next question, and again, we have lots of little questions that have to get answered, and the methods for answering them are all over the place, right? They don't exist yet, or they exist in other areas. We wanted to know what public relations role was in this global media ecology. Today, there's all these people who participate in the creation, promotion, transition, and consumption of messages and information. Our network society, right? Your Castell's network society means that we are all connected, and that everything is changing, that networks are occurring. What we wanted to study was, how did public relations, organizations, and practices help this global media ecology exist? So how do we get the film industry, and the newspaper industry, and the TV industry, and the ad industry, and public relations, and all of these groups, and all these associations, and all of these actors in what would be called the global media ecology? What keeps them together? Well, I bet you know what my answer is. Public relations. Exactly, right? Smart. Only took you 40 minutes, right? So here's what we did. We took 141 national journalism associations. Again, we made our sample 3 times larger. And then 91 public relations associations, because we didn't have to have a shared sample, right? It didn't have to be matched. It didn't have to be from Australia, or it could be all of them. And then we treated their websites as a seed, and we looked for all of their relationships across 3 levels of their website. We ended up with a sample of 2981 organizations from those seed organizations. And then we looked to see, and this is by hand, who connected to who. And that was the global media ecology. It was universities, it was governments, law firms, it was NGOs, it was the United Nations. And here's what it looked like. This is the Media Ecology Network. It's almost beautiful. In networks, you have an organization that connects others, and others connect to each other. This is actually quite elegant. You see a series of nodes of groups of organizations who are connected together, and you see organizations connecting other organizations together. So you actually see that there is some logic to this. There is a relational logic amongst, and you wouldn't have thought you would get this from just looking at professional associations, but because of the function they play in society, they're very well connected. So this is the media ecology that we saw. And of course our paper goes into much more detail about what these are. We decided to look to see what happened if we removed all of the journalist associations. And we decided to see what would happen if we removed all the public relations associations from this global network of interlinked groups. When we removed the journalism associations, the network looked almost the same. So they were providing redundant ties. But when we removed the public relations associations, we came out with a much more diverse network that wasn't as well connected. The argument is that it was public relations organizations that was tying together the global media ecology. And that's what it looks like when they're pulled away, and the fragmentation, you take it out, and you look to see the relationships. They're not nearly as strong and as deep and as varied. You see most organizations just connected to 1 or 2 others. So what is public relations' role in an organization in society? We argue that there's actually different roles: a relationship initiator, a facilitator, a broker, and we saw this sort of large, fully functioning society facilitator. The public relations role in the network is essentially to create this, where this might exist. So sort of the end here, what's public relations' role? Well, the goal is to study dynamic networks, to move away from this dyadic relationship between an organization and a public, and to understand that today's society, because of technology and globalization, is incredibly diverse and wide and strung together through a variety of ways. The next step is to take other questions about public relations role in society and start figuring out how to measure it. Could we have chosen other organizations and associations? Yes, and somebody should. Is hyperlink analysis the best way to do it? Probably not. But it's one way. And so right now the goal is figuring out how we fit in and how do we move the practice of public relations from the traditional functional media relations, move it through this co-creational idea of shared meaning, and start thinking about how public relations helps networks of groups, individuals, communities function. And then once we get there, we can actually start thinking about a much larger role for public relations in society. Questions? I'm late, 5 minutes. Hi, yes.
I was interested in one of the things you just said, sorry for coming out.
That's okay, you said you were going to.
Where the hyperlink, you're not sure if that's the best indication of influence or meaning. So speculate about what you think the hyperlink means. Are people hyperlinking without direct connection?
Excellent question. So here's what we did. We did 2 points in time, right? So we did it over a year period because that's how long it took essentially the first time to get all those matched. I use graduate students who mutter my name and swear, no, not Adam, Nafida, poor Nafida. So here's what we did. We did 2 points in time to make sure it was a stable relationship. Always recognize that connecting to another organization means that you are consciously identifying that as an important organization to you. So we can connect to anybody. What we're interested in too is when they connect back to us, because that's a relationship. An online relationship.
But it can happen without knowledge of it, right?
Yes and no. Some organizations don't allow you to link to them.
But I mean, I can connect to an organization.
You can hyperlink to it.
Connect to me, but we might not even know that we're reciprocating.
I think your computer person probably would know.
Would know.
Right. And so we were interested in both the one way, right, the giving, and essentially the giving of credibility to another, and then the receiving, and then we were interested, of course, when they were reciprocal. So what could we do? Well, we could do interviews, right? So we could interview these organizations and talk to them and ask them questions about, well, who do you strategically link to? And what are other ways to link to other organizations? One of our other studies has been looking at the co-occurrence of organizations at meetings and conferences. We're studying the HIV/AIDS network in China. And so we look to see who attends the same conferences or who works on the same projects. So we're constructing that. Others, in other countries, I have one in Iraq and one in Liberia, we ask people to identify who they talk to and who they collaborate with. We look at joint grant proposals and projects. So network analysis can be anything from having people identify who they talk to. Now, in some countries, it's not so easy and safe. And in others, they'll lie and they'll say, I'm connected to everyone. I know everybody, and everybody knows me. And then you do a network analysis and they're an isolate. And then you have to explain to that to them. I don't think they think you play nice. And then you see organizations that you don't expect to be central because everybody trusts them. And then for civil society, what happens when you find an organization that everybody trusts? That's where you put your resources, because their activities will bring in others and they'll amplify the efforts. So that's why network analysis is so interesting. And hyperlink analysis is just one method of it.
But it's interesting and it's academic and conceptual, but boy, that can be practical too. I could see teaching our online master's students who are working professionals about how to locate these places for resource allocation.
And actually through social media, Salesforce.com, which is one of those marketing programs that you can buy. By the way, you get 10 licenses free if you're a nonprofit. You might want to talk to them. They are donating a command center to our school, which is going to be very exciting. But they actually do social media, so you can actually look to see who's a central actor in a network, whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or any of the other international social media.
We might have a pair mic. We don't have that here. Call it one day.
Oh, good. So did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated by your concept of communitas, and in anthropology, as you know, in the 60s, Victor Turner came up with this, the whole concept of liminality, which was kind of isolation or being at the edge, and communitas, which is what you mentioned. So what is new here? I mean, this has been going on for from 18th century, ever since society was formed.
It's a new metaphor to think about the relationship between public relations and journalism. Because the duel, the dance, and the seduction, those metaphors don't really describe how public relations and journalism work together today. And Communitas in those countries actually describes how their values, how each group's values are actually shared in how they perform their societal functions. And that was the term that emerged. I started reading about how do we find a place where there's this overlap between different people or things. And the Communitas just seemed to be more valuable. And students love it because they experience it when they go to sporting events or religious, right? Because it came out of religion.
So that brings me to a question. You asked about what was common between the countries that you mentioned. If you could go to that slide.
Oh, sure.
The countries that you mentioned where you visited. And I was thinking about the countries that you listed.
Right there.
Yeah, go ahead. The one.
Oh, right there.
So if you look at these countries, except for one, they have pretty normal civil societies. In other words, they are not like Pakistan where there could be a blast and it disrupts life. So you were looking at very peaceful nations. I mean, thank God, because some of these.
Turkey and Thailand and Malaysia. No. I mean, Malaysia is fraught with underlying tensions between Indians and Malays and Chinese. Thailand, Turkey, the same thing, right? It's the civil society is actually under enormous pressure in Turkey, especially under this most recent government. So it didn't. We looked at Hofstede, right? We're like, oh, maybe it's it's one of those cultural factors. No. And we're still curious. I mean, we want to go deep and find out why. And again, it couldn't be as simple as one organization, and it could be, say, the French or the Germans went around and helped those organizations in those countries develop their codes of ethics. We know how codes of ethics are constructed, right? We know that they're political tools to help a profession explain what it does. Every word is chosen carefully, because you want to put the best face forward on your practice. I don't know, we're still looking. I'm excited, I can't wait to find out. Maybe it isn't one factor, but clusters of factors.
So I was fascinated why you were only looking at societal values. What about political values, which is a very important aspect because I was reminded when George Bush got re-elected, you remember the first thing he said on his re-election speech. He says, I earned some political capital, and it was kind of surprising that it took him 4 years to realize that. But that was a very sensible statement.
Okay. We looked, political systems obviously no, cultural systems no, economic systems no, level of civil society. If you think about Freedom House, right, we're in the Freedom House room, right? So media freedom, no. Like IRIX Media Sustainability Index, nope. We're still looking, and we wrote a couple case studies about these countries, but is it an anomaly? Are we looking for a pattern that doesn't exist? I don't know. It could be a master's thesis here for somebody.
No, I wanted to share this with you because my old professor in Ohio, he's really old now because he's retired.
Professor Culbertson?
But, Hugh Culbertson.
Yes, Professor
He used
Culbertson.
to analyze the SPE context, which is socio-political and economic. And I was rereading his book the other day, and it's really fascinating how he relates public relations. So I was just curious.
Right, and actually Professor Culbertson was one of the reasons I went into international public relations.
Yeah.
Because he wrote the 1992 book on international public relations. Yes?
I did my undergrad in psychology, so
Okay.
I'm always interested in that side of things.
Okay.
So just wondering how much, if at all, you studied kind of like
Didn't.
at all.
No, I don't think so. I mean, as a student or in the study?
No,
right
in the
here?
study, whether you looked at kind of the personality traits of.
No, I didn't. That would be great. Thank you. Adam, write that down. Next page. Personality. You want to come on with us as a third author?
I mean, not saying no.
You would have a diverse tie, right? Become a part of a different network.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
First of all, that was a terrific talk. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I'll leave, some questions to my students, but my perspective is I admire your theory building work, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenges in, you're arguing pretty much for a paradigm shift in conceptualizing public relations, and I thought it was interesting that you found pushback within journals in our own field, right? So let alone the wider field of
The wider field is much more open to this, I've discovered.
Okay. Can you talk more though about how even within field you can you're working to shift over?
Sure, and actually that's one of my favorite topics, and when I teach a PhD seminar in public relations theory, we start with the beginning theories, the functional theories, then we move into the management, we read excellence, then we read to OPR, then we read dialogue, my favorite. And then we start moving into civil society and all those other things. It is hard to get that published, because in the beginning, the conceptual piece, and that's why you start in my list of how you do this. You start with the conceptual, and it's hard to get conceptual pieces published, because everybody can beat them up, because you forgot something. Well, of course you forgot something, because you only got 30 pages in order to tell a story. And if you're taking into all these variables into account, you need more than 30 pages. So actually, I came out of Purdue, which was not part of the dominant excellence paradigm. And so I was always on the fringes of public relations research. So this is not different. We never expected dialogue to become what it was, what it has become. So I've always been on the outside. And so it just is sort of normal to see these questions, and when you think about network analysis, globalization, and technology, we see the world differently. And so I think that makes the paradigm shift possible. But I think we're out of a paradigm right now in public relations. We have the excellence paradigm, which if you read Kuhn's book about what paradigms do and what they don't do and what they do to stop a field from growing, we're out of that. And nothing should replace it. We don't need a paradigm. What we need is a diversity of theories that explain and help us understand our role in society. So it's hard to get conceptual pieces published, and that's why these kind of activities are good, because it forces you to sit down and really think about how all these things go together. And that's why we have many people working on this in small studies, and eventually we really will have an understanding. We could be wrong. And then hopefully somebody will go in a different direction, and that'll be exciting. So the nice thing is for the younger people in this room, and I'm going to look over on this side.
That's unfair.
For the younger people over here, this is the best time to be in public relations, because there actually is a body of knowledge now. When I got my PhD in 1996, Hugh Culbertson's book, Public Relations Review, was just starting to publish, essentially pieces of research. There wasn't much there. Now you have something to go back to. And see, the whole world is open to you right now, because you've got some theories, you've got some methods, you're in a doctoral program that's interdisciplinary with journalism and mass communication, and you got communication, you got health and all these things. This is the best time to be in the field, because you have the actual chance of making a difference and contributing perhaps to a paradigm shift that begins to answer different questions. And that's really what paradigm shifts do. When the questions can't be answered by the traditional theory of the field, the paradigm disappears and new theories emerge. But why that paradigm is there, it stops and stifles the discussion. And the research that people do is called mopping up. And so they look at symmetrical communication in another country, or they look to see how social media helps organization engage in excellence. And it goes deep, but it doesn't answer big questions. So, no pressure. Yes, you get the last question, I think. One more question, Adam?
Sure, we can do one or two.
Okay.
Sure. So it makes me a second to articulate this, but for Dr. Camilla's PR seminar, we read your piece about Bosnia and NGOs in Bosnia after after the breakup of Yugoslavia, and I was just thinking about one of the studies that you had just shown us about if you take the public relations component out of the network, then journalists are more isolated. I was wondering if you've ever read about or perhaps engaged in any research that talks about the types of people that become public relations practitioners that are kind of, maybe there's a few that are hyper-connected. I'm thinking about books like Connected or kind of that social psychology movement. But is there any research that you know of? Is it the organization itself that's hyper-connected, or is it that a few people just know a lot of people?
I think it's going to be the few people know a lot, because a lot of the transitional economies and nations, the people went to the same schools, right? They might even be related through second and third family ties, and they were in a certain sector, and they had cultural capital. I actually think that cultural capital on this one is going to play a large role, because you have to trust. If you're a non-governmental organization in a post-conflict environment, who you're going to partner with? You're going to partner with somebody you trust, because you don't trust anyone. Trust is low in these societies. So I actually think it's cultural capital that determines which organizations are most successful. Not always, but maybe in the beginning, it gives them that head start, because they already have a pool of people to pick from that they can count on.
On this day, it's September 11, how do you think, based on your Communitas theory, how do you think our America got together? I mean, that was a pretty, when I think of that day, 14 years ago, it was a Tuesday, the nation seemed devastated. So, if you were to give a take 14 years later, what would you say?
Well, this morning, USA Today, which was at my hotel, did not have a story on the front page. So, we think about agenda setting and the media's role in reminding people about these events. So it was about 10 a.m. before I realized that today was September 11th.
On page 2 and 3 of the New York Times, every ad said remembrance, from Tiffany to remembrance.
Because in New York, it was so close to
But they were all the companies.
Oh, like the boss people, sure.
RTA, they all had black and white
Right.
photos.
And so it might be, and I don't know how the rest of America experienced 9/11. I lived in northern New Jersey at the time. It was devastating for us. We had interns in those buildings. Luckily, they were all late. Because Rutgers students they were late. They had to come up on the train. So they were okay. But I can't tell you. I just noticed USA Today, when I opened it up, it was only when I got into the paper that I noticed that it was 9/11. So, but we don't have to go back to that grief and that pain for Communitas, right? There are activities, right? The women's soccer match, right? That was pretty cool, right? I watched it and I enjoyed it, and I felt very strongly for America and for women during that.
Which women's soccer match are you talking about?
The most recent World Cup.
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
When we won?
The one we
I wanted to get back to a more public relations level. In terms of, you remember, right after 9/11, a lot of cars, or suddenly we found a lot of people flying the American flag. I don't think it was there before in such a big way. And I felt that there were certain things that happened that brought our community together, really. I mean, if you look at it. So I was thinking, what was your take on it? And I do understand media making, goof up.
I haven't thought about it, because I think the problem is that time has elapsed. There have been other issues that our nation has either had to go around or has divided us, right? It's been a kind of divisive the last couple of years, hasn't it, in the United States? So I would say that the Communitas that we might have felt after 9/11, I don't see it here now. But I didn't think of Communitas at 9/11. It hadn't come into my sphere yet. So I would be trying to place it on top of an event that I hadn't interpreted like that. But I would say that there are many things that are dividing us now, and that maybe were dividing us before, and maybe we just had those few shining days. And then that first anniversary, I think, probably brought a lot of those things up. But then we were embroiled in the events of 2003, Iraq, that then also helped make the country go apart. So I don't have an answer. Yes?
It might be out of time, but so I'm not that familiar with the Arab literature, so.
But I bet you're really excited now.
Yeah, no, I am. But I am
intrigued by your suggestion, and it seems like as you situate yourself within this larger tradition of PR research, that you're now offering a different level of analysis. That PR works at the level of civil society as a
Community and
whole.
civil society.
And but at least the story that you're telling about the bad old days of instrumentalism or bastardized pragmatism, it sounds like, got me thinking about what your suggestion seems to be missing as it hits the level of the public, right? So, or like that Dewey might have talked about, right?
Sure.
The formation of publics, or the productive formation of publics. And so I just wondered if you could talk about that.
Sure.
Yeah, like how do we get from your account of the production, or the bettering of civil society as a whole, to an account of the role that PR plays in the productive production of
And
mobilizing?
that's one of the next studies has to be. It can't just be up here. This is multi-levels, multi-networks. We have to start using it of how individuals and how small groups share communication, share meaning, activate, advocate, and become publics. But the question is it around issues? Or now today, because of the availability of technology, it is around a like, right? Something that you love. You know, cats, cat videos, or certain types of shoes or dresses. I mean, is that how publics are forming? And Dewey would probably be very sad because it's not around an issue, it's around a preference. But that's definitely the next step, is one of the steps, not the next step, but one of the steps is to look to see, is this bottom up? Can we actually use any of these theories at the individual level to form publics? And does a public have to be the way that we used to think about it, or because of technology and globalization, is it enough that we have people all across the world thinking and activating their own communities? Are they a public?
One last very small question. Which team do you think will win the Tennessee Open?
Am I still being recorded? The University of Tennessee.
Thank you.
Go Vols.
Go Vols.
Well, thank you all for coming out. We'll be over at 4 o'clock. Okay.